everyone, and welcome back to the channel for a special video. As some of you already know, I am a huge fan of late Ursula K. Le Guin's writing. So much so, in fact, that I consider her one of my currently 3 favorite authors. Barring one exception, I have also, to the best of my knowledge, read all of Le Guin's published fiction. This isn't at all the case when it comes to her poetry or non-fiction writing, but I have an item from each of those categories on my physical TBR, so that will happily change in the near future. In any case, given my familiarity with and love of her storytelling, and as a little homage to her, since today would have been her birthday, I have decided to go over Ursula K. Le Guin's fiction Bibliography, so it can serve as a handy little reference of sorts for those of you interested in reading her books, or more of them, as the case may be. I will first go through her fantasy writing, most of which is primarily aimed at younger readers, follow with her science fiction writing, which is aimed at adult, or at the very least, older readers, then wrap it all up with a couple of works that don't neatly fall in either of those categories. I will provide a brief presentation and synopsis for each work, then a few personal thoughts focusing on themes and reasons why I would recommend it or less so, keeping in mind the fact I read a fair few of them a while ago now and thus won't always have the freshest opinion to provide either. And to be clear, no, I won't be doing actual individual book reviews here, right? That being said, I have, in fact, reviewed some of Le Guin's stories on my channel before, and will make sure to specify this whenever relevant. Starting with one of Le Guin's genre classics, written and published over 30 years between 1968 and 2001, the Earthsea Cycle is a high fantasy series made up of a quintet of novels: A Wizard of Earthsea, The Tombs of Artuan, The Farthest Shore, Tehanu, The Other Wind, and a collection of short stories titled Tales from Earthsea. It is set in the eponymous world of Earthsea, a planet-wide, I guess? I've actually always been a little unsure of this, collection of large islands and archipelagos of smaller islands. Its magic is rooted in an ancient language and true names, basically think the magic of creation and being, and it is sex-segregated, as only men are allowed to study and use high magic. Additionally, it's what I'll call fully conscious beings, for simplicity's sake, are divided into 2 related species: civilized humans aligned with earth and water, and wild dragons aligned with fire and air. A Wizard of Earthsea, the first book in the series, follows teenage Ged as he goes to the island of Roke to study at one of fancy literature's OG magic schools, as he learns to handle his power, or not, as he faces his shadow, and eventually goes on to become one of the most powerful mages of all time. He is one of the series' main recurring characters, but others such as Tanar, Lebanon, Tehanu, and a couple of dragons become just as important to the story in time and subsequent volumes. The series starts out aimed at younger readers, but progressively matures with each volume, which is also why I think Tehanu and The Other Wind, both books that deal with heavier themes such as aging and death, will be more appreciated by older and or more experienced readers. I've read Earthsea twice, once as a teenager and once as an adult in 2019. It is not a favorite of mine, either in terms of fantasy or Le Guinian fiction, but I do retain a strong fondness for its world, themes, magic, and, well, dragons, of course. The latter certainly constitute an element I particularly enjoyed both times I read the series. Earthsea's dragons just feel very special because of their very nature as spiritual kin to human beings, in a way only fantasy can allow, of course, since we're all agreed it doesn't make a lick of sense from a purely biological perspective. Earthsea also has a mythical feeling to it, reminiscent, for me, of Tolkien's Legendarium, which I love, and which here I both appreciated for its quiet beauty, yes, and found frustrating for the distance it placed between the story's development, characters, and myself as the reader, and that is also a problem I had with The Lord of the Rings, as it so happens. On the theming front, Earthsea deals with the conflict between change and preservation, deep questions surrounding identity, freedom, the use and loss of personal power or agency, as well as aging, love, and death. With Book 4, like I said, Tehanu, and Book 5, The Other Wind, dealing with the former and latter specifically. The multifaceted impact of gender dynamics, a quintessentially feminist theme a decent proportion of LeGuinian fiction is known for, also comes into consideration in Tehanu, my favourite Earthsea novel. The Earthsea Cycle is a series I would recommend to those who enjoy the more quietly thoughtful, even more domestic, in the case of Tehanu, corners of high or mythical feeling fantasy, with a dash of draconic goodness thrown in. I also think it's a good multi-purpose fantasy series, in the sense that it can be appreciated by multiple age ranges, and by readers with differing levels of fantasy experience. I could also see it as a good option to read to or with one's child, kind of like the Harry Potter books. Published between 2004 and 2007, The Annals of the Western Shore is a secondary world fantasy trilogy comprised of the following titles: Gifts, Voices, and Powers, the last of which received the Nebula Award for Best Novel in 2008. This is what I like to call a looser trilogy. The main characters of the first book appear in the second, a side character of the second book becomes the main character of the third, but that isn't really a single overarching story linking all three volumes, and all of them can, more or less, be read independently of one another. That being said, the trilogy as an interrelated whole centers on the peoples and city-states of the titular Western Shore of an otherwise unnamed landmass. Psychic gifts play an important role in Book 1, hence the title, but the fantasy elements of this series are otherwise kept to a minimum. Additionally, I would say the trilogy is primarily aimed at young adult readers. I read this trilogy back when I was smack dab in its target age range, as a teenager, and as such don't remember it in too much detail, but I do recall enjoying it, and it helping to cement my then rapidly growing appreciation of LeGuin's generally immersive, often inspiring, and certainly distinctive writing style. These books also feature her characteristic interest in the dynamic relationship between the individual and society or culture, what I'll term anthropological world-building and related theming, if you will, and this will come up again a few times. Book 2 specifically takes a look at the impacts of slavery on individuals and generations as well, and Book 3 features one of the very first examples I ever encountered of a matrifocal, or at the very least matrilineal, society in fiction. I think. I'm unfortunately not entirely sure of this recollection and couldn't verify it online, so do take it with a few grains of salt here. In any case, I would recommend this trilogy to younger and or less experienced fantasy readers looking for something that feels a little different from your more standard secondary high fantasy epics, or something that encourages you to gently think about culture, society, familial legacy, or trauma, and how these affect the individual a little more, perhaps, than you've previously been accustomed to. Published in 2008, Lavinia is a shockingly under-acknowledged, to my mind, standalone mythological retelling of the Aeneid. I say shockingly under-acknowledged because female-centric, rather than feminist, stricto sensu, mythological retellings seem to have become quite the hot commodity in recent years. LeGuin's pre-trend mythological retelling of Virgil's epic centers on, you guessed it, Lavinia, the Latin princess Aeneas, Prince of Troy and legendary ancestor of the founders of Rome, took to wife. The story follows her as she meets and binds her fate to Aeneas, and illustrates the daily lives and rituals of the Latins a pre-Roman people in the process. Lavinia is a quieter and fairly domestic mythological retelling. Its supernatural elements are minimal, and it is a character-centered tale that focuses primarily on its protagonist, Lavinia, and the faith and ritual-imbued lives of her people, the Latins. I read it as a teenager as well, but remember its mythical quality being skillfully executed, finding its historical, pre-Roman and pagan world-building engaging, and thinking it had an enjoyably haunting, melancholy passing of ages feel to it as well. I'm pretty certain I bought this novel in the young adult section of my local English bookstore back in the day, but definitely think adult mythology retellings, female-centric or otherwise, enthusiasts could enjoy it too. It certainly stands on par, as far as I'm concerned, with more recent entries in the subgenre, no doubt about it. The Beginning Place is a kind of portal fantasy novella first published in 1986 that tells the story of Irene Panis and Hugh Rogers, two suburbanites living in difficult circumstances with troubled families. Both independently discover a place hidden in a local wood where time flows much more slowly and where it is always evening. This beginning place serves as a threshold between the world of Earth and that of an idyllic town called Tembria Brezzi. Though Hugh finds it first within the story, Irene has been visiting this other world for some years and has established a second life with a local adoptive family of sorts. Both, however, feel a sense of belonging and home there they otherwise lack in their lives. Then, because it must, something goes wrong. Irene discovers the villagers of Tembria Brezzi can no longer enter or leave the town because of the petrifying sense of fear, which may be caused by a monster she and Hugh will have to hunt down. I read this novella in 2019, and I did not like it. Just because LeGuin is a favourite author of mine doesn't mean I love, or even necessarily like, every single one of her stories, just that I like or love a majority of them. Now, don't get me wrong, The Beginning Place wasn't trash either, I just didn't really get the point of it. It had great atmosphere. In fact, the perpetual twilight world of Tembria Brezzi actually reminded me of The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess's Twilight Realm. And that was pretty neat. But given this is a LeGuinian story, I expected a lot more in terms of deeper world building and theming. There's also a romance in this novella I don't think worked at all, and a really off-key, out-of-place sex scene as well. So this isn't a LeGuin story I feel particularly inclined to recommend, unless you're a completionist basket case of a fangirl like me, or you just really enjoy atmospheric portal fantasies for the sheer sake of them. A quick note before I dive into LeGuin's science fiction writing. Its rich corpus can roughly be divided into two categories, or I mean, that's what I'm choosing to do at any rate. Stories belonging to her Hainish cycle on the one hand, and stories either set in our version of reality, one simply unrelated to that of the Acumen, or left ambiguously unlabeled on the other. I will cover the latter category first, though do keep in mind some of her short story collections feature stories belonging to both, but I will specify this when applicable. The Lathe of Heaven is a standalone novel that was published in 1971 and received the Locus Award for Best Novel in 1972. Its story takes place in a vaguely dystopian Portland at some point in the not-too-distant future, and centers on one George Orr, a man whose dreams change the very fabric of reality. Indeed, when George has an effective dream, it changes the world around him, and to such a degree that its history is completely rewritten in the process. By that, I mean that as far as anyone else knows, the world has always been the one George just dreamed into being. George, however, remains distressingly aware of the truth. He starts taking pills to prevent himself from falling asleep and accidentally editing reality, but the ensuing addiction is discovered by the local authorities and he is duly sent to a psychiatrist for mandatory treatment. Unfortunately, Dr. Haber eventually finds out about George's peculiar ability and decides to harness it in order to improve the world with increasingly unpredictable and disastrous results. The Lathe of Heaven is a rather trippy story with an undeniably memorable premise. I'll concede it's also pretty fantastical science fiction, and one could reasonably argue science fantasy would be a better fit here, genre-wise. Either way, I think this novel stands out because of the way it commits to the following intertwined ideas: that tweaking small and seemingly innocuous variables can actually trigger veritable cascades of change here in the very fabric of reality, and, well, that one should be careful what one wishes for. Dr. Haber seeks to change the world for the better, in his view, and manipulates George into dreaming those changes into being, but messing around with the, let's say, proverbial butterfly effect will always incur unforeseen consequences, because everything is interconnected. Reality is one giant, dizzyingly complex web of cause and effect the human mind can't possibly apprehend in its totality, which means that, yes, good old human hubris and Hell's Road being paved with good intentions are also themes you will find in this novel. I've only read The Lathe of Heaven once, but it has left a lasting impression on my mind, and I definitely want to reread it someday. Like most of LeGuin's fiction, this tale is beautifully driven by its ideas, and in a way that never loses sight of the human element. As such, I would recommend this one specifically to readers looking for something with a strange or unusual premise on the one hand, that is fully and skillfully utilized to delve into thought-provoking theming on the other. The Eye of the Heron, a novella published in 1978, takes place on a planet named Victoria that was originally settled by two waves of Earth colonists. One made up of prisoners fated for penal colony life, the other made up of political exiles. A few generations later, the former inhabit a city and essentially make up the planet's upper caste, referred to as that of the bosses, whilst the latter live in neighbouring shantytown and live lives essentially devoted to farming. But these people of peace, as they are called, wish to widen their horizons and settle a valley further away from the city. Unfortunately, the bosses have other ideas, and conflict thus ensues. I first read this novella in 2019, and whilst I can't say it has left that great of an impression, I do remember finding its theming on conflict, peaceful resistance, and the limitations of idealism fairly engaging. Indeed, the people of peace, who are descended from political exiles, espouse a radically pacifist philosophy. But given the bosses' opposition to their, let's say, right to self-determination, some turn to violence to deal with the conflict and escape subjugation. As is the trend with LeGuin fiction, this shorter story properly commits to its fundamentally human-centric themes, and I would recommend it on those grounds. Though I would not advise you necessarily start with this novella, given it's not exactly her most interesting story either. Changing Planes is a short story collection that was published in 2003 and received the Locus Award for Best Short Story Collection in 2004. The collection, as a unified whole, conceptually centers on a conceit derived from a pun expressed in its opening story. That the low-level discomfort, or boredom, one experiences whilst in the process of changing planes in an airport can cause one to hop from one plane of reality to another. Because time flows differently on different planes, one can spend a week visiting another plane and still return in time to catch a connecting flight. The collection's through-line character, Sita Dulip, thus proceeds to visit 15 different planes and describe the societies that inhabit them, which I guess also means you could technically say this collection qualifies as portal science fiction as well. I was first made aware of, and then subsequently read this collection in 2020, and thoroughly enjoyed it for the bite-sized chunks of imaginative world-building it gave me, where different societies, sometimes similar, sometimes not, to those of Earth humans are tweaked in specific but thought-provoking ways. It's not a personal favourite, given it doesn't especially focus on the kinds of themes I prefer as a general rule or as executed by LeGuin, but these short stories certainly do feature her signature brand of anthropological or ethnographic science fiction, if you will. I would thus mostly recommend this collection to readers already familiar with LeGuinian fiction, looking for more of that, and or to readers specifically looking for shorter, anthropologically inclined science fiction. A Fisherman of the Inland Sea is also a short story collection that was first published in 1994. It numbers 8 stories in total, 2 of which do take place in the Hainish cycle. And I'm a little embarrassed to say this is the one body of LeGuinian writing I remember the least, and thus have the least to say about. I do, however, remember one of its Hainish cycle stories takes place on the planet O, and the people of O are very interesting when it comes to relational arrangements, but I will come back to this in a few minutes when I talk about another short story collection. Otherwise, I'm really sorry that I cannot, in good faith, recommend this collection too strongly or for any specific reason other than the fact it's LeGuinian fiction. So, if you're already a fan of that, odds are you will enjoy these stories as well, as I remember I did, but without further detail. The Wind's 12 Quarters and The Compass Rose are 2 short story collections that were first published in 1975 for the former, 1982 for the latter, and then reissued as an omnibus edition in the SF Masterworks collection in 2015. The Wind's 12 Quarters doesn't really have a central unifying premise or conceptual conceit. It simply features various short stories, some of which do take place in the Hainish cycle, or are even related to its full-length novels, like The Left Hand of Darkness. The Compass Rose, for its part, does sort its stories into sections following a directions-related motif, though not strictly in the sense of a compass's directions, as the title counterintuitively implies. In this case, however, none of them are related to the world of the Ecumen, as far as I can recall. I first read The Wind's 12 Quarters when I was a teenager, then reread the collection, and read The Compass Rose for the first time in 2019. Taken together, they make up a, for one thing, chonky, and for another, fairly variegated short story collection, and it's a little difficult to further qualify it as a whole. I certainly enjoyed it as a whole because I enjoy LeGuinian fiction, and because I enjoyed here most of the collection's stories. But there's a lot of variation in terms of length, setting, theming, and just overall quality between them as well. 2 stories that particularly stand out to me are Those Who Walk Away from Omelas, and it's one of LeGuin's better-known short stories as well, and Vaster Than Empires and More Slow, but there are obviously many more I found engaging and thought-provoking. I would definitely recommend this omnibus collection specifically to beginner and more advanced LeGuinian fiction enthusiasts alike, if only because of the sheer variety of stories it has to offer. Keep in mind, however, that overall, it doesn't specifically focus on social justice or feminist themes or even anthropological exploration like some of her better-known works do, though those are not completely absent from this collection either. Always Coming Home is an experimental novel published in 1985 that describes the life and society of the Kesh, a people from the distant, post-apocalyptic or post-collapse future. But this is not dystopian fiction, quite to the contrary, I would argue. Always Coming Home qualifies as utopian, or at the very least, quasi-utopian fiction, more than anything else, with its utopia being, more or less, anarcho-primitivist and matrifocal or matrilineal egalitarian in nature. Indeed, the Kesh use technological inventions of civilization such as writing, steel, electricity, trains, even a computer network, but unlike one of their neighboring societies, the Condor people, they do nothing on an industrial scale, reject governance, have no non-laboring caste, do not expand their population or territory, consider disbelief in what we would consider supernatural absurd, and deplore human domination of the natural world. I also call this an experimental novel, and this is because Always Coming Home functions more as an anthropological or ethnographic thesis than anything else. There is, among these pages, a kind of novella, yes, but you will also find notes on the music of the cache, their religion, recipes even, if I remember correctly, rituals, etc. in this book, and not as an appendix. The creative non-fiction of sorts here takes up as much, if not more, of the page count as its through-line narrative does. I first read Always Coming Home in 2019 as well, and loved it. It features, for one thing, my favourite fictional utopia to date, and very strongly appealed to my deep love of thoughtful, theme-nourishing world-building for another. But I'll admit, it's also a mildly challenging book, in that it does not read like a traditional novel. I suppose it technically counts as a type of metafiction as well, and goodness knows, I generally do not enjoy that, yet it worked for me here. Yay. It would be fair to say this is a more advanced example of LeGuinian fiction, but I would still highly recommend it if you enjoy metafictional approaches to ideas-driven science fiction, definitely. If you love anthropological science fiction, because this is like cranked up to 100. If you loved The Dispossessed and The Left Hand of Darkness specifically, because this book also touches on utopian and feminist ideas, but then also if you specifically loved books such as Sherry Astepa's The Gate to Women's Country, and even more so, Marge Piercy's Women on the Edge of Time, for the exact same reasons. Before I proceed on to the Hainish cycle fiction, a quick reminder that it is principally characterized by the following. A. Human beings in this version of reality originally evolved on a planet called Hain 1,000,000 or so years ago. These Hainish ancestors eventually took to the stars and settled numerous planets, including our own. B. At some unspecified point in time, the Ecumen, a pacifist interplanetary NGO of sorts, dedicated to the acquisition, preservation, and transmission of knowledge of all kinds, was founded for the benefit of all humanity. And it is because of this central concept that I sometimes refer to the Hainish cycle as the Ecumenverse. C. The Hainish cycle does not feature FTL travel, but its peoples have access to the Ansible, a device that allows for instantaneous, time-debt-free communication between any 2 points in the known and populated universe. Worlds of Exile and Illusion is an omnibus, first published in 1996, then more recently reissued in the SF Masterworks collection in 2020, that brings together 3 stories. Rockinen's World, first published in 1966, which follows a scientist named Rockinen as he visits a planet home to 3 different humanoid species or races and becomes entangled with their culture and politics to potentially disastrous effect. Planet of Exile, also first published in 1966, which takes place on the planet Wirral, where a local solar year lasts 60 Terran years and Wirralian seasons, as a result, last 15 Terran years each. A bit like it works in A Song of Ice and Fire, actually. The plot centers on the interactions between native Wirralians and the dwindling remnants of a Terran colony, whom the former refer to as the Farborn and perceived to be witches, and a potential conflict between those 2 factions and hordes of ravaging barbarians. And finally, City of Illusions, first published in 1967, which follows an unnamed male narrator with no biographical memory as he sets out on a mysterious but potentially perilous journey to Estok, the city of the Shining, the Liars of Earth, and enemy of mankind. I must note here that whilst all of these stories are yes, technically set in the Hainish cycle, they were also written before most, if not all, of LeGuin's better-known Ecumen-verse novels. In fact, the Ecumen, as such, does not feature here at all. Rather, you get a proto-Ecumen, if you will, called the League of Worlds, and honestly, the Hainish cycle's broader timeline doesn't make all that much sense, at least where Earth is concerned, if you take all of the stories that are canonically set in it into account. But it's also understandable, precisely because the stories in Worlds of Exile and Illusion predate those firmly set in the world of the Ecumen. Besides, I'm pretty sure Le Guin never actually intended to create a Brandon Sanderson or MCU-style universe either, so that's not what you should expect in any case. I just wanted to clear that up for the sake of accuracy. As far as I can recall, I first read this omnibus when I was an older teenager, and I'm afraid this is another of Le Guin's works I don't have the most detailed or illuminating recollection of. I remember enjoying these stories well enough, especially that of Planet of Exile, if only because of its world-building and the whole, A Song of Ice and Fire-esque seasons of it all. Although, I suppose it would be more accurate to say it is A Song of Ice and Fire than a Planet of Exile-esque seasonal cycle. I'm being cheeky here, of course. These are also older Le Guinian stories. As such, they do not display the full brilliance of her creative voice and thoughtful theming. But that doesn't mean they aren't worth reading either. I'd recommend reading these either to get a feel for Le Guinian fiction with the knowledge that you'll get to enjoy even better stuff later on, or conversely if, as an appreciator of Le Guinian fiction, you'd like to see some of its earlier, less polished examples. Before I continue with the rest of the Hainish cycle fiction, a quick disclaimer. Take as a given that I would confidently to very highly recommend all of the following novels and short story collections. With that in mind, I will thus only further tailor my recommendations based on the themes or narrative motifs specific to each work. The Dispossessed, an Ambiguous Utopia is a 1974 novel that won Ursula K. Le Guin the Hugo, Nebula, and Locus Awards, the Triple Crown, the Grand Slam of SFF fiction, that very same year. The Dispossessed is set on two related worlds in the Tau Ceti system, the planet Urus and its moon Anaris. The former is politically dominated by two rival superpowers, that of Alo, a state with a capitalist economy and patriarchal society, and that of Thu, which has an authoritarian system that claims to rule in the name of the proletariat. Anaris, for its part, was settled after a revolution on Urus by the followers of an anarchist thinker named Odo, who is the central character of a previous short story titled The Day Before the Revolution, which you can read in the Wind's 12 Quarters collection as an FYI. Anaresti society is thus an anarcho-syndicalist one, but whilst the governing powers of Urus gave its moon a guarantee of non-interference, relations between the two worlds aren't exactly the greatest. The Dispossessed plot specifically centers on Shevek, a brilliant Anaresti physicist whose work is being stifled by jealous colleagues as he travels to Urus to continue his research into the principle of simultaneity and its implications for instantaneous communication across the civilized universe. This, in effect, eventually leads to the invention of the Ansible, a device crucial to the Ecumen's existence and goals. It is Shevek's hope that he will find on Urus greater tolerance for and less impediment to his ideas, but alas, things turn out to be a lot more complicated than that. The Dispossessed is one of Le Guin's best known and celebrated works of fiction, and as you may have gathered from the synopsis, the novel deals very directly with complex political themes: anarchism, capitalism, revolution, utopianism and its limitations, individualism versus collectivism, and how this impacts scientific research as well. And I'm sure a lot of the feeling's finer nuance went right over my head, given I read this when I was a teenager and haven't reread it since. I know, shame on me. Its utopian society was actually the first I ever encountered in fiction, but something about it clearly didn't appeal all that much to me, given it is not even my second favourite fictional utopia. I clearly wasn't that taken in by the novel's broader narrative either, given it's not even in my top 3 favourite LeGuins. That being said, I very much also need to reread this one, and ideally review it too. And as per my prior disclaimer, I would still absolutely recommend this novel to both ideas-driven science fiction and political fiction lovers. The Dispossessed is certainly a lot of readers' favourite LeGuin, but mine is The Left Hand of Darkness, a novel published in 1969, which won her the slightly more modest double crown of the Hugo and Nebula Awards in 1970. It is set on the planet Gethin, one of science fiction's OG ice planets, and follows the transformative journey of a Terran man, Genly I, who is sent to Gethin as an envoy of the Ecumen to extend its peoples an invitation to join it. Once there, he rapidly becomes entangled with the novel's other main character, Estraven, I'm actually shortening his name there, just as an FYI, and embroiled in the complex politics of the monarchy of Karhide. Notice I didn't say kingdom, or even queendom here. That's because of Gethin's other paradigm-shifting peculiarity. Its human beings have evolved to become, over time, what I choose to call bipotential hermaphrodites, though the word used in the novel is ambisexual. By that, I mean that Gethenians are born with the capacity, past puberty, to morph into either a fully male or fully female human being 1 week out of every month, and live as more or less unsexed neuters kind of the rest of the time. This has led them to form truly genderless societies, and this element of the world building is fully, beautifully exploited in service of the novel's properly feminist theming. But that's not all there is to it, no. I've read The Left Hand of Darkness twice now. Not only is it my favourite novel written by Ursula K. Le Guin, it is my favourite standalone work of science fiction of all time, and one of my favourite novels of all time across all genres. That's not just because of its near-flawless feminist theming, it's also because it packs, in a mere 300 pages or less, depending on the edition, so many other strands of delicately, but oh so skillfully executed world-building and related theming. Chiefly on the dynamic tension between stagnation or perceived stagnation and progress, on the reciprocally shaping relationship between human beings and their environment, in a similar fashion to Frank Herbert's Dune, as an FYI, and on the often blurry lines that separate love of one's home, or rather one's homeland, and the more violent aspects of nationalism. So yes, there is political theming here as well, though it is of a different degree in nature than The Dispossessed. There is also beautiful writing of a more spiritual flavour on the nature of time and being, but also on love and soulful human connection that bridges the divide of difference through the very moving relationship that develops between Genly I and Estraven. If any of that sounds interesting or worthwhile to you, then please give this novel a chance if you haven't read it already. And yes, obviously 100 times more so if you are specifically looking for feminist speculative fiction as well. For me, The Left Hand of Darkness is an absolute must-read in that regard, just like Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, or something like, once again, Sherry S. Tepper's The Gate Woman's Country. The word for world is forest is a novella published in 1972 that won the Hugo Award in 1973. It takes place on the planet Athshi, the single landmass of which is covered in one sprawling forest, hence the title, and peopled by humans who have evolved over time to become a lot smaller or rather shorter than your average, more standard human, and covered in greenish fur. I'll admit, I was vaguely reminded of, please forgive me, Star Wars Ewoks when I read it, though given the Afshians' actual description, I doubt they would actually look that much alike. They are also radical pacifists, and it is observed that murder, violent assault, and rape do not exist in their society. Unfortunately for them, Terrans have set up a military logging company on their planet and enslaved them. And the plot kicks off after an Afshian woman is raped, then killed by a military captain, and her husband decides enough is enough and leads a revolt, a violent revolt, against the Terran colonists, thereby introducing the moral dilemma of having to sacrifice one's pacifist ideals for the greater good. This is yet another LeGuin I've only read once and back when I was a teenager, but I remember loving this one for its environmental theming and the society building of the Afshians, which I found both fascinating and, given some of my own values, pretty inspiring too. A detail which has stuck in my mind all these years is that they are also described as being very affectionate and, if I remember correctly, more flexible, somewhat in their understanding of the boundaries a lot of real-life contemporary human beings at any rate would automatically place around things like friendship versus romantic relationships when it comes to physical intimacy, at least. Their touchy-feeliness, to my mind, isn't entirely dissimilar to that of the Legendarium's hobbits, actually. Outside of that, there is also theming here on colonialism, pacifism, and its limits. A theme also present in the previously mentioned Eye of the Heron. One could additionally argue there are conceptual parallels between this story and that of James Cameron's Avatar. So you know what? If you enjoyed the latter, I'd recommend you give the former a try on that basis alone. The Telling is a novel published in 2000 that won the Locus Award in 2001 and tells the story of Sati, a Terran sent by the Ecumen as an observer, not an envoy, to the planet Akka, where she witnesses the ongoing political and religious conflicts between its corporatist government and its indigenous people, whose main cultural and heavily spiritual tradition of oral storytelling, locally referred to as the Telling, is actively being suppressed by the authorities, and which Sati, as an observer, takes a particular interest in. I believe I read the Telling when I was a younger adult, and remember thoroughly enjoying it as well. It's a very quiet story, and whilst this of course applies to a lot of LeGuinian fiction, and that's not at all a bad thing, I found this qualifier especially applicable here. This story is fundamentally about cultural identity and its relationship to a kind of faith as well, to a certain extent, cultural preservation, and the political resistance one can carry out through that. There are parallels one can draw here to the events of China's Cultural Revolution, and the Telling, as a world-building element, takes, I think, inspiration from Eastern spiritual traditions. But that's also something you will actually find in several of LeGuin's story worlds. I mean, she did translate the Tao Te Ching, so I don't think it's too much of a stretch to assume this is something she had an interest in, and presumably, you know, to some extent found inspiring. 4 Ways to Forgiveness is a collection of 4 connected short stories, first published in 1995, that take place on the sister planets of Werrell, though not the same Werrell as Planet of Exiles, and Yeowei. Werrell is chiefly characterized by a long history of institutional enslavement of its lighter-skinned ethnic groups by its darker-skinned ethnic groups. When the Ecumen eventually makes contact with Werrell, this paradigm-shifting event spurs the nation of Voideo to develop a space program and settle with the help of a significant population of slaves the neighboring planet of Yeowei. But this also eventually leads to an opportunity for these slaves to revolt and gain their freedom. And the collection's narrative basically follows this process and its ramifications over time. I don't remember anything specific about this collection when it comes to plot developments, characters, as I've only read it once, and it is not a favorite of mine. But if you want theming on the complex facets, mechanisms, effects, of the human tragedy that is slavery in your LeGuinian fiction, this is the one to read, without question. Though do keep in mind, this theme also appears to a lesser extent in the previously mentioned Annals of the Western Shore. Especially given this makes the interesting and, in my opinion, rather clever world-building choice of showing that institutional slavery that is partly, at least, justified through colorism can theoretically happen to any color, or rather ethnicity, etc. And the sad fact is, back on Earth, slavery has happened to many different peoples throughout history, regardless of this criterion. This is obviously a delicate topic for several very understandable reasons, but that's precisely why I think discussing it in fiction in non-standard ways like this is very valuable. The Birthday of the World and Other Stories is a collection of short stories that was published in 2002. It contains 8 stories, 6 of which belong to the Hainish cycle, one of which remains unspecified, per LeGuin's own introduction, and one which is set in our universe in the future. There is no unifying theme or concept here. This collection simply gathers different stories that were written throughout LeGuin's career, and one collection exclusive titled Paradise Lost. That's the story set in our universe, and it is a thought-provoking little gem of a generation arc-ship story. I'll add that one of the collection stories is set on Geffen, one is set on Wirral, and serves as a conclusion to 4 Ways to Forgiveness. 2 are set on the planet O. So as promised, the people of O are interesting for 2 reasons. 1, their society is divided into 2 moieties, that of morning and that of evening, and people from the same moiety are not allowed to have intimate relationships with each other, as this would be considered incestuous. 2, the people of O marry in groups of 4. These groups are referred to as sederetu and must include a pair of men and women from each moiety. Each sederetu is thus made up of 2 homosexual couples and 1 heterosexual couple, as the man and woman who belong to the same moiety are not allowed to consummate their side of the marriage. The stories set on O in the Birthday of the World specifically explore how relationships, intimacy, love differ, or not, with such arrangements, as compared to more traditional dyadic ones. I first read this collection when I was 17 years old, and reread and reviewed it for this channel last year. I loved it the first time I read it. I adored it the second. It is now my favorite short story collection written by LeGuin, and beyond that, one of my favorite works of science fiction. Because this collection, for the most part, does specifically focus on some of my favorite themes. Gender and sex-based oppression, spirit and being, love and relationships, solitude and identity very specifically, all are explored, and beautifully so. Ursula gathers a set of related short stories and 1 novel titled Malafrena that were written in the second half of the 1970s and most recently reissued in an omnibus edition in 2016, and which are all set in the fictional Central Eastern European country of Ursula between the years 1150 and 1965. This makes this body of fiction speculative history from a conceptual standpoint, but it honestly just reads as general fiction otherwise. And for Malafrena specifically, general fiction that emulates a style one would associate with 19th century literature. In fact, the novel's events are themselves set in the 19th century, and its story is essentially a multi-generational family saga. Per her own introduction, LeGuin wrote these Ursinian tales to pay homage to modern European literature, and honestly, I'd say she did a great job in that respect. Like I just said, Malafrena reads like a 19th century novel. Its themes revolve around family heritage, social and political revolution, idealism, youth versus experience, all against a tumultuous backdrop of 19th century history. I found all of this very well executed, yes, but I don't read LeGuin to get a fix of modern European literature, right? I read LeGuin for that sweet, dazzlingly ideas-driven speculative fiction. As such, I prefer the short stories she set in Orsina overall. These gave me bite-sized chunks of story that allow me to focus on and appreciate the depth of her here very realistic nation building, if you will. I would thus recommend Orsina to readers who just love LeGuinian fiction, regardless of genre or selected themes, to those looking for more or less contemporary renditions of 19th century literature, and to those who mostly enjoy general or light historical fiction, but don't mind a creative twist thrown in once in a while. Concluding this overview with the one work written by LeGuin I have not read. Cat Wings is a quartet of children's picture books illustrated by one S.D. Schindler that was originally published between 1988 and 1999. Individual titles are as follows: Cat Wings Return, Wonderful Alexander and the Cat Wings, and Jane on Her Own. But these were reissued as omnibus editions titled Tales of Catwings and More Tales of the Catwings in 1999 and 2000, then the Catwings collection in 2003. The story, from what I gathered, basically follows the city and countryside adventures of 4 kittens who were mysteriously born with wings. Hence the title of Cat Wings. And that's all I can say about it, as I have not read it and will not read it, given I'm just not interested in reading children's books I haven't previously read, at any rate, as an adult. What I can say, however, from the little bit of research I did, is these books certainly do look and sound very cute and charming, and thus perfectly suited for their target audience, namely children ages 4 to 8. Ursula K. LeGuin has written some of the most thought-provoking and thoughtfully moving fiction I've ever read. And my favourite LeGuinian stories are favourites because they have managed to touch my mind, heart, and soul. Her fiction is ideas-driven in the best possible sense of the concept, and beyond that, is generally characterised by its quiet grace, its beautiful nuance, its what I like to call luminosity, its compassion, humanism in a way, its hopefulness even, and radical lack of cynicism. Social justice, sex-based, race-based, class-based oppression and socialization, political philosophy, utopianism, pacifism, spirituality, religion, environmentalism, even technology, yes, to some extent, and how all of these things affect people, their sense of self, identity, their relationships to one another, and, yes, the greater whole of life, nature, creation, whatever you want to call it. All are themes you can find, more often than not, impactfully explored in LeGuinian fiction. Late Ursula K. LeGuin, in this bookworm's humble opinion, was a truly brilliant feminist fiction writer, a truly brilliant speculative fiction writer, and, quite simply, a truly brilliant writer, period. If you'd only ever heard or read of Ursula K. LeGuin before watching this video, I sincerely hope this overview of her published fiction will spur you to try it out, and that you will delight in it, if only a little. If you were already familiar with and appreciative of Ursula K. LeGuin's writing, then I sincerely hope watching this video will add a few books to your TBR. And if I may ask just one thing, if I have missed something in this bibliography, A, my deepest apologies, but more importantly, B, please let me know in the comments down below, for my sake certainly, but also for everyone else's. Thank you. And on that very final note, I hope you all have a lovely day, evening, or whichever time of day you prefer. As always, do please take good care of yourselves. Thank you for the continued support, and I shall see you all, hopefully reasonably soon, in another video, but until then, bye-bye.